Hello and welcome back for lesson 3 of the book of John. You should have prepared by reading John chapter 6 verse 1 through chapter 10 verse 42 for this week. I've pastored a number of churches, and in one of the churches I served, and it was towards the beginning of my career, I remember being challenged over communion. Particularly, I was challenged because I had an event where I didn't have any of my typical communion stewards. And I was stuck trying to figure out, what am I going to do? It's difficult at any event for a pastor to do the service, serve communion, and serve bread. So at the time, we had Olivia, and Olivia was very young. I'd say probably 4 or 5 years old maybe. And I looked at her and said, "Would you like to help Daddy with communion?" Of course, being a child in the church, she was ecstatic at the possibility of helping to serve communion. And I watched this child. I learned a lot in this one-time event, and I've talked about it many times, but I watched this child, after putting on hand sanitizer and being clean, rip out huge chunks of bread and give them to the people. And I saw a lot of laughter and shocked expressions on faces. But I was challenged because at a later date, people asked me, why would I let a kid do that? I was also challenged in that church to answer, why would I let children receive communion? My policy has always been, it's up to the parents, but I will never turn a child away. We in the church excel at division, separating men from women, the old from the young. Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour in our entire nation. People of different ethnicities go to their own churches and not to our churches. We might say it that way, except the reality is we don't know how to accommodate and be accepting of all nationalities. I'm, of course, speaking in broad terms. In this part of the Gospel of John, we begin to understand that Jesus is there for everyone. In fact, Jesus' understanding and kind of the presentation of communion that begins to come out of these verses is one that challenges our notion of what communion is. John chapter 6, verse 39 and 51 are kind of the theme verses for today. "And this is the will of him who sent me, that I should lose nothing of all that he has given me, but raise it up on the last day. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. Whoever eats of this bread will live forever, and the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." This area of understanding that communion is available for all, but not only communion, this section of John really pushes the idea that salvation is for everyone. And there's a lot of theological discussion here about whether or not Jesus' work saves everyone, regardless of any decision anybody makes, or whether there is still a need for a personal acceptance. Last week we obviously talked about the personal acceptance part, or implied it, I should say. But today's section really does talk about everyone being saved. We have to allow John's words to challenge how we understand communion and how we understand salvation, even today. Too often we can approach a text like this and go, oh, well, it's not just that because it says in this other part of the Bible. Resist that. Allow it to challenge your notion of who God is and what God is doing. Because in the Gospel of John, Jesus is working to lose no one And Jesus is trying to bring everyone to the fold. Yet as people who come later, we always try to throw up barriers of who is in and who is not, which seems very contradictory to what Jesus is doing. So here's the deal, and here's what I want you to begin to reflect on in your small groups. Take a moment to start reflecting on communion. What do we mean by communion being available to all? Now I know some of you might go, well, it's just available to all, but no, what do you really mean by that? Almost everyone has exceptions, and almost everyone struggles with the fact that they know they want to have an exception. So maybe explore who you would struggle with turning away from communion and why. But also then look at the issue of salvation. Start to wrestle with the fact that John implies that everyone will come to Jesus. And it's not about a personal acceptance. What does that mean for you? Is there hope in that for you? Or am I espousing wrong theology in your mind? Have a conversation about that and begin the process of trying to understand what salvation is at another level and what communion might mean. How do we balance communion? How do we reach out to others with these notions of community? Have a good discussion.